I'd like to buy a mint condition Spider-Man #1, please.
And I'd like an hour on the holodeck with 7 of 9. Oh, Saturn's rings. Let me get that for you.
Worst intro ever. Well, at least I hope not, but regardless, welcome back, true believers and all you spectacular Spidey fans, to another very exciting Marvel Spider-Man 2 related video. Now, even though we currently only have a slight fraction of info relating to the overall story that will be featured within Marvel Spider-Man 2, and the primary narrative that will surround the entirety of the game at large, we obviously can already tell what direction Insomniac is going based on the previous stories we've already experienced within Marvel Spider-Man 1 and Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales. Not to mention that Bill Roseman himself has already gone on record stating that Marvel Spider-Man 2 is going to be darker than both of Insomniac's previous Spider-Man games. And while Peter and Miles did undergo some rather intense and extremely impactful narrative moments within both of their respective games, things are likely going to get a whole lot more interesting by the time we see their stories continue within Marvel's Spider-Man 2. So, as a great way to prepare yourself for everything that Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is going to entail by the time it releases in 2023, especially considering what Insomniac might pull off in terms of its story, I figured that I would go fully in-depth with my own personal top 5 picks of the primary Spider-Man comic books I believe you need to read before playing Marvel's Spider-Man 2. And just as a heads up for any of you who may have potentially not read any one of these comic books, this is going to be a 110% spoiler-filled video. There are a lot of crucial story beats that do occur within each of these individual Spider-Man comics, and some of them, depending on how exactly Insomniac decides to approach this game's narrative, may end up being adapted within the game itself. So in case you haven't completely caught up with all of Spider-Man's comic history thus far, which to be fair, it is quite a lot, just keep in mind that the storytelling possibilities for Spider-Man within the realm of comic books is seemingly infinite. However, I am rather certain that the majority of you watching this video will know at least one of the comics that I will be bringing up today. And in fact, the #1 pick on my list is without a doubt an all-time classic. And in my personal opinion, hands down one of my all-time favorite Spider-Man comics, especially considering how Venom himself is finally going to be making his appearance within the Insomniac game universe in Marvel Spider-Man 2. This comic as a whole could very well end up showcasing exactly what his origins might be within the Insomniac game universe, in comparison to the much more streamlined universe of the 616 Marvel canon. And of course, I am talking about none other than the Ultimate Spider-Man comic itself, specifically the overall arc which relates to Venom's story. Now, besides this story doing something completely new and innovative when it does come to Spider-Man's relationship with the Black Suit, we also get a completely new dynamic when it comes to Peter Parker and Eddie Brock himself, where instead of being die-hard rivals with each other, they actually end up starting off as childhood friends, which end up reconnecting with one another by the time the Ultimate Spider-Man storyline begins pertaining to the Venom symbiote. Even if you somehow have not yet read fully through the entirety of the Ultimate Spider-Man comic book series, specifically relating to Peter's relationship with Venom, I do think that there is a pretty good chance that you may have ended up playing the Ultimate Spider-Man video game, which not only is an utter masterpiece of a Spider-Man game in its own right, but is also directly based off of the events from this particular Spider-Man comic. And to take a step even further, the game itself expands upon the Ultimate Spider-Man comic lore in a way that the comics themselves never managed to fully do. Now granted, there was the War of the Symbiote Spider-Man storyline within the Ultimate Comics, which Bendis wrote after the game released, but I personally tend not to talk about it as much since I believe it is utter trash in comparison to the game itself. I thoroughly love this origin of the Black Suit, considering how, unlike the 616, this is actually not an alien life form of any kind, but instead it is essentially a synthetic substance that was crafted by Peter Parker and Eddie Brock's fathers. Scientists Richard Parker and Eddie Brock Sr. worked together to develop a revolutionary means to heal humanity of disease and illness, creating a symbiotic biosuit that would encase and augment the wearer's body, naming it Project Venom. And when the years go by where we end up seeing him as a student at ESU, Eddie Brock Jr. discovered a sample of the Venom project and began to study it under the oversight of Dr. Kirk Connors, which, as we can see, is also featured at the very end of the post-credit scene of Miles Morales. By the time Peter ends up reuniting with Eddie, he is disgusted and enraged over how Trask Industries robbed their fathers of their life's work, and Peter's new goal at that time was to return to the lab and take a sample of the suit to research it on his own. And as we all know, the rest is history. I remember being absolutely obsessed with this comic when I first read it as a kid, and even after revisiting it now in 2022, it still holds up extremely well. There's also a really cool twist within this storyline which I was not expecting the first time I read it, where Peter Parker lets his rage consume him so much so to the point that he ends up turning into Venom. And by the time Peter ends up duking it out with Eddie once he gets the symbiote latched onto him, it ends up creating an extremely dynamic and impactful confrontation between these two childhood buddies.
Don't do this, bro!
We're not brothers!
Our parents may have died together, but you had your precious aunt and uncle. We had no one. We've always been alone. Until now.
What makes this comic even more important is that issue 35 of Ultimate Spider-Man did showcase the very first appearance of Venom within the universe. And if you did manage to look very clearly during the Penthouse mission of Spider-Man PS4, we do see Mary Jane look at the two incidents that have been recorded by Norman Osborn. And besides the Martin Lee instant creating Mr. Negative, if you do look at the near bottom of the screen, we do see a title labeled GR35. And if that doesn't tell you that Insomniac does their research, or to get even more excited as to how exactly Venom may end up being handled within Marvel's Spider-Man 2, then I don't know what will. Now moving on to my second pick is also within the Ultimate Comics universe, but instead of relating to Peter Parker, we are of course moving on to Miles Morales. Specifically, I am talking about one of the darkest stories that does involve Miles with his run as Spider-Man, and exactly what happens to those around him once he does encounter Venom within the Ultimate Universe. And while this narrative might not be nearly as good as the initial story that was told with Peter and Eddie's characters within the Ultimate Universe, it still manages to push Miles' character in a very important direction. And in this case, I am talking about the Ultimate Comics Spider-Man Venom War story arc. When Betty Brant tried to uncover the true identity of the new Spider-Man, who obviously at that point was Miles, who was also the successor of the deceased Peter Parker, Dr. Conrad Marcus, who was a former Oscorp scientist that helped create the spider that bit Miles, stole one of Roxxon's samples of the symbiote and used it to transform himself into a new version of Venom. And shockingly enough, as Venom, Marcus broke into Brant's apartment and killed her, and then moved on to attack Jefferson Davis, who of course is Miles' father, believing him to be the new Spider-Man based on Brant's research. The new Spider-Man, who was actually Miles, appeared and attacked Venom, and the two of them fought until the police arrived, where it ended up mirroring the initial fight that Peter had with Venom in that first story arc. Venom then managed to escape by slipping into the sewers, leaving Miles to the police. Compelled by the symbiote's desire to either bond or consume Spider-Man, Venom later reappeared at the hospital where Jefferson Davis was residing. Venom went into a frenzy within the hospital, demanding that he be given Spider-Man, and Miles appeared yet again to hold him off until help arrived. As Venom ended up consuming Miles, Rio Morales, who of course is Miles' mom, tried to shoot him with a pistol to no effect. Venom turned his attention to Rio and mortally wounded her just as Miles used his Venom Blast to break out of the symbiote and separate it from its host. Conrad Marcus, after being separated by the suit, was shot by the police and killed. Unfortunately, after Miles' fight against Venom seems to be successful, it ends up resulting in the life of his dear mother. At this point of Miles' story within the Ultimate Comics, it is essentially his death of Gwen Stacy moment, traumatizing him and leading him to abandon his role as Spider-Man, declaring shortly afterwards that he will be Spider-Man no more. Not only is this comic extremely important because it showcases Miles' first ever encounter with Venom in the Ultimate Comics universe, but if we end up applying this to Marvel's Spider-Man 2, I have become 10 times more scared to see exactly what is going to happen by the time Venom ends up encountering other people within the personal lives of each individual Spider-Man. If Venom ends up going after people like MJ or possibly Rio Morales within Marvel's Spider-Man 2 and ends up killing one of them, that is without a doubt going to send Miles and Peter off the deep end. But again, knowing how Bill Roseman emphasized just how dark Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is going to be, makes me, as a fan of the Venom character, extremely excited to see what Insomniac does with his portrayal in the game. And just as a side note, screw Conrad Marcus. I mean, Eddie Brock is my personal favorite host of the Venom symbiote, and Conrad was pretty much a nobody within the Ultimate Comics. And while it has already been heavily implied that Harry is going to be the host of the Venom symbiote within Marvel's Spider-Man 2 instead of Eddie Brock, I'm just hoping that we don't see Conrad appear anytime soon. Now, as we continue with my number 3 pick, directly relates to a character that is heavily implied to be within Marvel's Spider-Man 2 based on the narration that we did hear in the initial trailer. Considering that the individual within the trailer was talking about having an equal to go up against him and giving him what he desires, it's pretty clear that we can assume that the person narrating the trailer is none other than Kraven the Hunter, which, as you would expect, directly relates to possibly one of the best Spider-Man comics ever created, and easily the best Kraven story ever created, with none other than Kraven's Last Hunt. Insomniac would be downright foolish if they were to not at the very least look at this comic for inspiration when crafting their version of Kraven the Hunter. While we have only seen Venom appear within the Marvel Spider-Man 2 trailer as an officially confirmed villain within the game, I still think it is safe to say that Kraven may end up having a pretty significant role within Marvel's Spider-Man 2 one way or another, proving to be an equal challenge for both Peter and Miles respectively. And based on everything that occurs within Kraven's Last Hunt, there certainly is a lot of circumstances that may arise within Marvel's Spider-Man 2, and how Peter, Miles, and Venom may all end up having a very intriguing connection with Kraven in some way. But for the case of Kraven's Last Hunt, Kraven decides to fully embrace his more bestial side and attempts to kill Spider-Man, in order to take his place as his superior and fully prove once and for all that he is the better man. Now, while Kraven doesn't end up genuinely killing Spider-Man, he does bury him alive, leaving Peter to fully rot in his own coffin for over 2 weeks, but also deciding to take up the mantle of Spider-Man himself. Spidey does eventually escape his buried doom and decides to pursue Kraven yet again in order to beat him. However, in a shocking turn of events, Kraven decides to confess to everything that he has done and ends up killing himself. There's a lot of depth and layers to explore for a character like Kraven, and this comic manages to seal the deal completely. We don't necessarily know what type of relationship Peter has with Kraven within the Insomniac universe, but it is going to be pretty darn exciting to see exactly what Insomniac has up their sleeves by the time we see him officially within the game. Now, when it comes to the penultimate pick on my list, this comic is one of the oldest, or should I say earliest, narratives that did showcase Spider-Man wearing the black suit. Or more specifically, exactly the first time we see Spider-Man come to terms with trying to remove the symbiote from his own body. And while we don't have official confirmation yet that Black Suit Spider-Man is going to play a pivotal role within Marvel's Spider-Man 2, we clearly see Venom as a main presence at the very end of the Marvel Spider-Man 2 trailer, which does indicate to me that hopefully at some point during Marvel Spider-Man 2, Black Suit Spidey will play a factor within the core narrative. And if we end up seeing that classic separation anxiety between Peter and the symbiote, you'll definitely want to read Web of Spider-Man Till Death Do Us Part, which did release all the way back in 1985. At this point within Spider-Man's life in the comics, Peter Parker has just ended his relationship with Black Cat, and can't seem to shake the feeling that something is out to get him. As Peter decides to suit up as Spider-Man, he catches his reflection in the mirror and is horrified to see that the symbiote reveals itself and covers his entire body. Keep in mind that this was still fairly recently after Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four had informed Peter that this suit of his was actually a living alien organism. Peter continuously struggles to try and free himself from the symbiote's grasp, but sadly to no avail. After a rather deadly encounter with the Vulture, Peter ends up at the top of a church and knocks himself into some church bells, realizing that sound is one of the weaknesses of the alien substance. The sound of the ringing bells is overpowering to Spidey while he is wearing the black suit. Thinking that he actually may end up dying, Peter can't stop thinking about Aunt May and all the unresolved feelings that he has for Mary Jane. Suddenly, the symbiote separates itself from Peter's body completely and tries to flee. However, the bond that the symbiote had with Peter was so strong that it actually had a sense of love for him, and risked its own life to drag Peter to safety so that way he wouldn't end up dying from the trauma of its separation. Now, as you diehard Spidey fans can probably tell, is that this comic was a huge source of inspiration relating to the symbiote storyline in various forms of Spidey media. Mainly with how Peter ends up separating from the symbiote in the 90s cartoon as well as the Spectacular Spider-Man series, and most famously would obviously have to be how it was portrayed in live action within Spider-Man 3. And for me personally, I really hope that this is somehow implemented in a very emotional way within Marvel's Spider-Man 2, showing how far Peter might fall with the influence of the symbiote on him, only for him to finally realize it's not good and end up trying to separate himself from it, is a huge arc of growth for Peter to inevitably experience, and will only proceed to make it even more intense by the time we end up confronting Venom. And lastly, my final pick of the main comic that I do believe you need to read before playing Marvel's Spider-Man 2 is actually a multitude of comics that directly pertain to the core lore of the Insomniac Spider-Man universe. And if you're a ride or die Spider-Man PS4 fan like myself, you'll know that I'm referring to the Insomniac Spider-Man tie-in comics with Spider-Man City at War, Spider-Man Velocity, and Spider-Man The Black Cat Strikes. If you're someone who doesn't want to fully replay through the main story of Spider-Man PS4 just to keep yourself informed with what's going on in Marvel Spider-Man 2, you can always try and read the entire series of Spider-Man City at War, which is essentially an extremely shortened and summarized version of the Spider-Man PS4 based storyline in comic format. We also have Spider-Man Velocity, which takes place after the game's main campaign, but before the City That Never Sleeps DLC, which might be seen as nothing more than a slight spin-off series, but it also does a very cool job of making one of the alternate suits within the game canon, and also introducing some very intriguing side characters. But out of all these, the best one out of the bunch is without a doubt The Black Cat Strikes, which not only does a great job of recapping the City That Never Sleeps DLC, but also fully gives you even more insight to Peter and Felicia's relationship during the time where Peter and MJ were broken up. We also get quite a lot of shocking and emotional scenes with Mary Jane and seeing things from her perspective after she was broken up with Peter, and dealing with the jealousy that comes with seeing Felicia back with Spider-Man. A lot of issues that people seem to have with MJ's character within Spider-Man PS4 are completely resolved within The Black Cat Strikes. Plus, as someone like me who loves everything about Black Cat and her relationship with Spider-Man, this comic was just pure bliss. Insomniac have proven multiple times now that they are massive fans of Spider-Man as a character and completely respect the source material that he comes from. So I have no doubt that they're going to do something completely unique and interesting within Marvel Spider-Man 2 that we've never seen before in any form of Spider-Man media, but will also acknowledge the source material in a very impactful and respectful way. And I for one just can't wait to see what lies in store. And with all that said, everybody, that is the video that I have for you today, and please let me know all your thoughts in the comment section down below. What do you think about my own personal list of the top 5 comics I believe you need to read before playing Marvel Spider-Man 2, and did you agree or disagree with any of my picks? And out of the main comics that I did list, which one is your personal favorite? Let me know what you think. Be sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy, and for more Marvel Spider-Man 2 videos like this in the future. Thank you all so much for watching. Stay spectacular, Spidey fans, and until next time, peace out.